Assalamu alaikum, Professor Khalid Blankinship. How are you? It's an honor to have you here today.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I feel honored to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been listening to your talks for a long time now, and it's amazing to be able to have this conversation with you today. Professor, just to explain what I have in mind for our discussion today, and then you can let me know if this works for you. In reverse chronological order, I was hoping that we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in Israel, Gaza, Palestine. But before that, I'd like to speak to you about what's happening in Syria in terms of geopolitics and the different the interest, regional interest, and also within Syria, what's going on. But even before that, I wanted to speak to you about general concepts of statehood in religion, Islam, the role of leadership, how leaders are elected, what authority they hold. Because I think these things, because at least in Syria, they're trying to build a state now on Islamic terms. And it'd be nice to understand what is the standards that we hold and how practical are they in modern times. But even before that, to start with, I just wanted to touch base on you about the current. It seems like that there's a peace, kind of not a peace deal, but a ceasefire negotiation underway. And I thought we can start by getting your opinion on that as well. What do you think for like an outline? How does that sound?
Fine.
Yeah, cool. So thank you so much. So before we start, Professor, would you kindly let us know a bit about your background? I know you're a convert to Islam. I'd love to know a bit about that as well, if you may.
Yes. So I embraced Islam in 1973 at the age of 24, and now I'm 76 years old. So that was 50, going on 52 years ago. And so I've practiced Islam during my adult life entirely. And there's a very long version of this, which I won't get into because we don't have time for that. But my family, we could say, were non-religious Protestant Christians. My ancestors came from the British Isles and Norway. From Norway in the 19th century, from the British Isles in the 17th and 18th centuries to America, the British colonies, and then became the United States. So I'm just a Euro-American ethnically, I guess you could say. But I was always interested in religion more than my family. And when I was a child, when my grandmother died, my parents thought that their sons should have some ethical training. So they started taking us to the Congregationalist Church, which is the extreme left wing of Christianity, beyond which there's no Christ in it. And they liked social gospel, political sermons, and so on. They just disliked liturgy and rituals and all of those kind of things, as well as, beliefs and such. So they weren't conventionally religious. And then after 11 years, they gave that up and abandoned the church, which I had already done. And in high school, some of my friends persuaded me to go back to another church. But then after a year, I left that because of textual criticism of the Bible, specifically of the Gospels, and my dislike of the concept of the God-man, which is presented particularly in the Gospel of John. Although one can make some interpretations of the Gospel of John that, we emphasize that, but nevertheless, that is what happened. And so I I became a hippie in the late 1960s. And then in order to leave that environment, I went traveling, and I traveled for 26 months as a backpack and spent about a year and a half in the Arab countries, where I started learning Arabic from people I encountered. And then, because I saw in the Muslim world what a strong family structure there was, and everyone was working for their families and so on, and I was doing nothing, that persuaded me to go back with the intention of teaching English in the Arab world, because I said, if I teach English, I won't be depriving an Arab of their work, because that's my language, so I can do that better than somebody else from the Arab country. But working in anything else, I cannot. For example, when I was traveling, I worked as a waiter in a restaurant in Lebanon for a time, which was very funny. So anyway, going back to the States, I went back to college to finish my degree that I dropped out from, and I was a history major, so I switched from Roman and Greek history to Islamic history, and studying that and reading the translation of the Quran of Pickthall in English at that time, even though I knew Arabic as well, it made me see that the qualities that I had attributed to the Arabs actually derived from the religion. And then that is the good qualities of family life, responsibility, social responsibility, and so on. And then I acquired an Arabic Quran and was reading that in my room. And that seemed to me like the voice of God speaking to me through 4,000 years of development of religious concepts in Semitic languages. It was very authentic. And at that point, I decided to become a Muslim, even though I did not know any Muslims. And there I was in my home city of Seattle, Washington, until a woman who was a classmate told me, I have these two Muslims staying with me. They came up to study Arabic in the program in the university in the summer, and they want to meet you. So they came over, and the man said, well, if you think like that about it, maybe you would like to become a Muslim, why don't you become a Muslim right now? And I said, okay. So that was that. And then I thought to myself, can I really do this Salah thing, the prayer 5 times a day? And within 24 hours, I found that was easy. And that was entirely possible and not a difficulty. So that's how that happened.
It's so amazing. Actually, quite unique for me. Mostly people convert to Islam and then study Arabic. So that's quite amazing that were you like in the academic world already? Is that why you were learning Arabic?
Well, I mean, kind of. I've sort of been academic nerd from childhood. I memorized history, geography, and things like that. I had some idea about things. And when I traveled around the Mediterranean in 1970, 1971, I visited like 30 ancient Roman cities, sites of Roman ruins, such as Palmyra in Syria, for example. And while doing that, then I saw the Arab society, it was a living society, and I became interested in that. And I also was attracted to the Arabic language, both because of its unusual script and because of its sounds, which I thought sounded nice.
That's very interesting. How far did you get into, like, how long did you learn the Arabic language? Are you like freely conversing in Arabic, or are you
Oh,
more
yes.
like,
That's the greatest accomplishment in my life, if I do say so myself. I learned
wow,
Arabic really well. And in 1989, 1990, 1992, and then again other occasions. But in those 3 years, I presented a 45-minute lecture in Arabic inside the Royal Palace in
wow,
Rabat, Morocco, in front of King Hassan as part of the Durus al-Hassaniyah, where the king had changed the old practice of the sultans, which was to receive knowledge at the feet of the ulama. So the alim would sit on a chair and the king would sit on the floor. He changed that into a media extravaganza, which also helped to, of course, legitimate his reign and showed him as, listening to the leaders of Islam. But he also widened it out to people who were not really ulama in the traditional sense, such as myself. So he would have some kind of professors would come in there, and nevertheless, they would treat us like the ulama, and we sat on the chair, and the king sat on the floor in front of us, and all the court was around us, the ambassadors on one side and the ministers and the military on the other side, and the other ulama around sitting there. And so I was able to do that, and that, of course, had to be conducted entirely in Arabic.
Wow. When was this? What year?
1989, 1990, 1992, before
Amazing.
King Hassan. And
Wow.
then in 2000, I recorded one of the lectures in front of that was presented when Muhammad VI was doing this, because he shrank it back again.
You're a brave man. I mean, for a Westerner to even consider start learning Arabic, you'd need to have like guts. And also, how you were saying that when you converted, it wasn't such a big problem for you to take on the 5 daily prayers. With a lot of people, especially the morning prayer is a struggle. So that's quite amazing that you kind of took that in your stride.
Alhamdulillah.
That's good. Um, in your work, I'm also wondering, because I think I've seen some of your videos with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. How does some of the work that he does intersect with your academic work?
Yes, well, in general, we could say that Sheikh Hamza and myself share a trend inside of Islam that is obvious among American Muslims, I guess, but is probably found in the other countries as well, which one might call neo-traditionalism, and that is that we try to follow the old traditions as much as we possibly can. So we respect the madhabs of Islam, of the fiqh madhabs. I myself consider myself to follow the madhab of Malik, for example, as the Sheikh Hamza. And Hamza has with him another professor there, Abdullah bin Hamid Ali, who is similarly in that school and following that kind of approach. So we have that sort of approach that we share. And I think we also have some other aspects that we share. And it is true, Hamza is my friend, and we converse on the phone several times a year, I would say.
This is why I love your talk so much, because you do hold fast to the traditional Islam, which I think is really important. And I think some of the people who try to modernize Islam to fit modern times is really troubling to see that. So this is why I really appreciate what you do.
Yes, there are some tendencies that I would warn against, because the thing is, we live inside of the cocoon of our 21st century reality. And when people are living inside of a particular reality, a particular dispensation, it's hard to get outside of it and see what's really going on, because you're inside of it. And then everybody has commitments to this, that, and the other thing, which also affect that. So it's sometimes hard to criticize it. And so, for example, the prevalence of nationalism is a big problem, and people don't really perceive that because they don't see how suffused everything is with nationalism thoroughly everywhere all the time. And so nationalism in itself is kind of state worship. And so it becomes the worship of a state, a nationality. The state is the embodiment of the people, and so on. And it's like an idol that sits on God's throne. So it's kind of like a kind of idolatry, actually. And that's just one example. There are many things like
Yeah,
that.
I really want to talk to you about nationalism, statehood in later on in this discussion, because as I studied it, kind of when states came into existence, they kind of replaced religious symbols, religion in many ways,
Yeah.
not just Islam, but all
Or they
religions.
appropriated them. And so then
Yeah,
you have religious nationalism, including some nationalisms which are marked only by religious identity, but are nevertheless idolatrous and not religious. And
yeah,
so then when they say, oh, it's a religious war, like, say, the Bosnian Serbian war over the breakup of Yugoslavia, or even, say, the Catholic Protestant struggle over Northern Ireland and things like that. No, it's not.
yeah,
It's nationalism. It is not religion that is
Yeah.
happening, even if the people are taking as the marker of their nationalism, they're appropriating religious symbols. And there is a general principle here, which is that in the relations between religion and state, the state always eats the religion, and the religion never eats the state. This is a general principle. The state eats the religion never eats the state. And I can provide historical examples going back to medieval times of that.
I think that's so true. Um, Also, I think it's nationalism, as I see it, it is at worst it's like idolatry, and at best it's like tribalism, and those things are things that Islam came to remove, and those shackles to break, and we kind of put them back on.
Right,
Um,
that's right. And there is, of course, love of home, that's a natural thing, that's acceptable. And so people say love of home environment. I mean, my home environment forever in my life, even though here I am 76 years old and I haven't lived there for decades, is Seattle. I'm a native Pacific Northwesterner. I know I visited all 39 counties of Washington State. That's my home. That's my original home. That's what I felt was home. And so all of those feelings from childhood that you get from living in the 3 childhood homes that I remember fondly there with my parents growing up. And so that is kind of like the womb that a person came out of. And now I live here, and now Philadelphia is my home, and it has been for a very long time. And more importantly, Philadelphia is my children's home. And for them, it is as essentially their home as Seattle is mine. So there is that kind of connection with the place. But in the end, one also has to acknowledge in Islam that the um, connection with a place also is simply a passing thing that's part of our passing life through the world.
yeah,
And what Allah says in the Quran, "Siru fil ard," travel around in the earth, and so on. He doesn't emphasize in the Quran this connection with place, actually. So um, the um, so generally the association with place, it's something that's natural and acceptable, but also it has its limits.
as I studied it, so when national states started coming into existence, obviously starting from France, um, Catholics and Muslims were the most resistant to the idea of statehood, because they just couldn't understand this concept of pledging allegiance to a location as a piece of land rather than a person.
Yeah, that is true. Although, in my historical analysis of it, the nationalism arose in the western fringes of Europe in the 7 Aboriginal nation states. These were nation states that all developed nationalism before 1600, and and because they had a long time to develop it, nationalism came to them as something more natural and easier to handle.
Mm.
And those states, starting with, of course, England, the ultimate Aboriginal nation state, and France, whose nationalism was provoked by the English, and Spain and Portugal, which are Catholic countries, but nevertheless are part of the Aboriginal nation states, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. And that is a closed set of the 7 Aboriginal nation states that were the original places that had nationalism. And then nationalism spread from them elsewhere because it was provoked by them. And as you mentioned, France being very important in that, the conquests of Napoleon of most of Europe, brief as they were, strongly provoked nationalism in Germany and Italy. And nationalism moved eastward, seeped eastward until it hit the Eastern European countries, which were all multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual empires that had not nationalism at all. Russia, the Tsarist Russia, was ruled by a dynasty of Germans who had hardly any Russian blood in them at all. and who spoke French, not German, as the court language. And so, this is just the opposite of nationalism completely. By the fall of the Tsar, Nicholas II, of course, now was speaking Russian because nationalism was on the rise, so they had switched to that. But these states, unlike Western Europe, where the peoples, the conquered peoples like the Welsh and so on, had a very long time to deal with this, and it was worked out and sorted out over centuries. It just hit Eastern Europe as like a wave of force, and everybody then became fanatically nationalist, and all the states, the incipient states, all the linguistic groups were claiming maximal areas that contradicted each other, and soon enough they were all massacring each other and driving each other out. And of course, that is the context in which Zionism really arose as well, which is the idea that the followers of the Jewish religion are actually a nationality and should have a nation state as well in order to protect themselves. So nationalism after England was justified everywhere else as a defensive measure, that, oh, well, those people next to us, they have nationalism, so we'd better get it too, or else we'll be overrun. So it became a defensive measure, and its excuse was, others have nationalism, so we have to have it too, whether it's any good or not. And that is a very difficult nut to crack. To dispense with that kind of argument, very, very difficult.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. I want to come back to this conversation because it's I've got it in my notes, and it's one of the most interesting things that I felt like I'm really hooked on it. But just to finish off on your background, so basically, because the other day I got a chance to interview someone called Dr. Patrick Bowen, who is a scholar, independent scholar on Islamic conversion and immigration into the USA. I didn't know
I'm aware of him, and he has actually contributed some very important research on the earliest Muslims in the United States and how Islam started to spread in the US at all.
I think he's a really good scholar, researcher, and an amazing guy. And I think, I wish him really well. I think he's like a really good asset to have from an academic point of view. So I didn't realize how relatively recent the interaction is with Islam in the USA. In my mind, I thought Islam kind of got introduced to USA back from when early days, because Europe was already familiar, had interactions with Islam, whether that was in Spain or Sicily or Turkey or these places. So I thought that would have transferred to the USA, and it would be like a natural kind of a transition. But I was surprised to know how recent it is, but also how few Muslims there are in the USA, because we look at media and we see Islam and we see people like yourself, Hamza, Yusuf. But I didn't realize how relatively recent the whole Islamic interaction is in the USA, but also how few Muslims there are in the USA. So how, in your conversion back in the 70s, how did you find that? Like, did people look at you thinking, is this like a hippie thing? What the hell is going on? Or
well, some of my hippie friends said, well, that's one of the most conservative traditions that if you're choosing, if you're doing that. But more importantly, my family, they were all right with it because they weren't religious. And they would say, oh, now he's on an Islam kick. So he's on the Islam kick now. And then when I persisted at it, they said, well, that's an improvement at least. And so, they thought it was an improvement because it made me, uh, go back to my family, that is, my parents and my brothers, and cultivate the relations with them again that I'd been abandoning previously. So they thought that was okay. But on the other hand, um, they continued to have typical non-Muslim Western attitudes about some of the aspects of Islam. So if they, put pork in our food by mistake, then, oh, haha, sorry, that was a mistake or something like that. I mean, it seemed like they were not very caring about the limits of our religion. But they tried to be positive about it, and they liked some aspects of it. Um, and my father, when he was dying of cancer, did embrace Islam at the end of his life in 1999. He took the Shahada, so at least that was something. And I told him, Dad, I want you to be a Muslim. And he said, well, I think about it. And then the next day, he did that. And he said, he really did that. And so, I had some interactions like that were good, and other people never mistreated me for it. And then here in Philadelphia, for example, where I'd already been a Muslim for a long time, and where by the time I came here in 1990, that was 17 years later. So Islam had grown and become more visible in the States in the meantime. And like going to the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is kind of a nest of neocons that I was invited to go to by a person to see what was going on. And there was someone arguing, a conservative professor, about the danger of American Muslims. So I stood up and argued with him. Instead of treating me like a Muslim would be treated, perhaps, that was, someone of Near Eastern or South Asian appearance, they tried to persuade me of their opinion, of their point of view. Another time, I was invited with my Lebanese colleague, blessed memory, Mahmoud Ayub, to the Union League, which is also a very hoity-toity, conservative thing, where the elite of the city are members and have lunch downtown in this old, very attractive building. And this was after some incident, maybe it was after September 11th or something sometime. And someone who was a member of the Union League, who was also my colleague at Temple, got the invitation for us to go there. So we went there, and each of us made a presentation. And after it, some of these guys who were judges and attorneys and doctors and so on, some of them said, oh, I really liked what you said, but I didn't care for what Dr. Ayub was saying. And actually, we were saying the same thing. So that was really funny.
I think that's true. And I think that's why converts are able to cut deeper into like cross cultures and relate to local people more than any foreigner or immigrant would be able to do. So it is a benefit and also maybe an extra responsibility as well. I
Yes.
remember, yeah.
Well, I do give the Friday khutbas. I've given Friday khutbas at Masjid Mecca near Temple for over 30 years, and I've given the Shahada to more than 100 persons, and so I worked on that, and may Allah guide people. That's all.
My mother-in-law, because my wife is a convert as well, my mother-in-law, before she passed away, may Allah forgive her, before she passed away, she converted to Islam, which was like a huge blessing and really kind of an honor for us. But so while she was like ill, I emailed all her family members to inform her them what her decision is, so that if, God forbid, the worst happens, then people don't think that we're just making things up, so we can kind of inform everyone in their lifetime, in her lifetime. And everyone was fine. They were saying, yeah, that's fine. And then when she passed away, we were preparing her burial according to the Muslim rites in the Muslim cemetery. And then there was a big, like, pull, kind of a resistance from some family members saying, what are you doing? She's a Catholic. She needs to be buried in a Catholic graveyard. And we were saying, no, remember, we emailed you, she converted to Islam. And they said, yes, but she's still a Catholic.
Well, there you have the identity problem.
Yeah,
See,
exactly.
it's identitarianism, which is
Exactly.
something completely different from religion and spiritual commitments. I mean, people's spiritual commitments, that's between them and Allah, or,
Yeah.
it's what's internal, and it's not just because, you belong to this or that or the other thing. And that's definitely something where there's a distance between this and that.
Mhm.
And from
So,
the position of the state, it's easier just to go by identity, when people are
yeah,
born into, oh, well, you belong to that, so there you are, check mark on
yeah,
that.
yeah, you're in that box.
Hmm.
Uh, so, Professor, talking about like Israel and Gaza, are you aware of this like this recent ceasefire initiative apparently that's being pushed by Donald Trump, I think? Um,
Yes, this is interesting, of course. And the thing about it is that behind Donald Trump, who is a very polarizing and controversial figure in American politics, there is the great big question mark, because people on all sides have these expectations of Trump.
yes,
Everyone
everyone is
seems to have the
excited. Yeah.
expectation. And I would say that more people are hoping that he'll do something that they would like.
Mm.
And a smaller group of people are completely dissenting and utterly rejecting him by Trump derangement syndrome and so on, and regarding him as, just beyond the pale, and anything he touches will be evil and so on.
Mm.
And so there's that split. And then but the expectations range from everything from Muslims who are expecting that, oh, Trump is now going to solve all these problems, he'll stop the genocide, and he'll stop, and also people who say he'll stop the war in Ukraine, he'll stop the foreign wars, he'll smash the warmongers and the neocons, and people on the opposite side who are like the Israeli settler movement, who are all celebrating and applauding
Yeah.
the coming of Trump and saying, oh, Trump will let us do whatever we want, and we can just, kill all the Palestinians and get away with it because of
Mm.
Trump. And so these are just polar opposites. And what will actually happen and what his true intentions are on this point, who knows? It's not possible. It will come out, obviously, when he's in office, but at the moment, it isn't possible to tell exactly what will happen. There are some good signs, there are some bad signs.
Yeah.
He appointed all these neocons to office
Yeah.
with him. But on the other hand, maybe his point there is to have them in office with him so that he can keep them under watch and have some control over them, or maybe gain some of them as allies against the other neocons who have been ousted because they were pro-democratic and that is pro-democrat party and anti-Trump. So it's hard to see. And I would say that Trump is shrewd. That is, I think that's a correct adjective to describe him. He may not be extremely well informed about everything, but he is well informed enough about things. So, for example, he had the um, uh, that he had some statement about the Palestine issue where he said that, well, there are two sides, but one side doesn't want to make peace. And then he went on further to remark, without naming names, that it was obviously Israel he meant does not want to make peace. So he's aware of that. And when he trotted out the solution of the century with Jared Kushner in his first administration, which was the rekindled Israeli plan that had been promoted by the so-called Israeli left or moderate Zionists as the plan for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to give them autonomy in a way that was very cut up into little sections so they could all be controlled by Israel still, and promoted that. I mean, he had to study and look at that. Obviously, he has some idea about it, and he has an idea of what's going on. And similarly with the Russian front, there's a good chance, I think, of all the foreign policy aspects of Trump, that the support for the Ukraine war against Russia will be removed and that there will be peace on that front. That is because on that front, the foreign policy establishment is not united in supporting the aggression against Russia. And so there's some hope for that. And even on Taiwan and China, there's some hope for that. And so we'll see what exactly will emerge from all of that. But I would not be extremely hopeful that much will change, because the president is just one thing in the government, and even though, overall. So that's overall. Now, as for this peace agreement that has been made, this is a huge climb down for Israel, because it makes a peace agreement with a ceasefire agreement with Hamas that they vowed to exterminate completely.
Yes.
And so that's why Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the ultras of the settler movement, are opposed to that, because that is definitely in contradiction with their exact position that they have taken. And I think Israel has become very costly to the United States, and costly in financial terms, but it's also especially costly in moral terms and in terms of information and propaganda around the world. It just is a bad look for the U.S. in general. And so on account of that, I would think, yes, Trump would like to stop that. And so there is some possibility this will work. What works and militates against it is Israel's long history of ignoring agreements or working around them to try to find ways to weasel out of their commitments. And the big one is that if Israel actually withdrew its armed forces from the Gaza Strip, which would be also a big come down, because some of them have been demanding that they annex at least part of the Gaza Strip and so on. The Israelis demand the possibility of attacking Hamas again and continuing to bombard the Gaza Strip. It's a very fraught situation, and I'm not sure what exactly will emerge from it.
I think you're right. I think if it does go through, and with the terms that are kind of being thrown about at the moment, it's kind of like a complete. So all the conditions that Israel has been putting forward all along, it basically means that it's failed in all its objectives. It hasn't been able to finish off Hamas. It won't be able to annex northern Gaza. It won't be able to have the Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt. It will have to withdraw its forces from all of Gaza. So yeah, it's a big climb down, and that kind of then also makes one wonder, because Biden kept saying, "Oh, Biden hates Netanyahu," and he's been swearing at him behind the scenes, but Netanyahu just wouldn't listen. But it makes me think that Biden all along was fine with all of this that was going on, because to some degree, I think Biden was ideologically committed to the project of Israel, whereas Trump, I think he is not ideologically committed. It doesn't mean that in future we can expect all sorts of good things from Trump coming up. But as far as this particular thing is coming, I think Trump is sensible enough to realize what you're saying, that Israel, and this is one thing that has been confusing everyone in every way you look at it. Israel is a drag on America from an economic point of view, from a PR point of view. It makes no sense. Yet America consistently and continued to back Israel regardless of what happens. And I think,
Well, Israel was a mistake, and it
yeah,
was a mistake for the Jews, and they did not calculate when they made this mistake what the result would be. Because when Zionism arose in the late 19th century, it was still just fine to go colonize the lands of non-Europeans. And the restraint against that was existing non-European populations that were too dense. So consequently, in the British Empire, when they colonized India, they never thought for a single day that they would replace the Indian population with British people. There was never, that thought didn't occur to them. It was only for exploitation, not for settlement. And when the Europeans went out in the 16th century, circling the world with their new superior ships, they prospected the world for Aboriginal places, regions inhabited by Aborigines with suitable climate that Europeans could come to inhabit. And they could easily wipe out the Aborigines. And that led to the foundation of the 6 successful settler states: Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and Uruguay. These are European settler states whose populations are overwhelmingly European that were founded successfully. There were also a lot of failed settler states, principally in Africa, such as the Italians in Libya, the French in Algeria, etc. And so when the Zionists came along, their project was, first of all, too late, because it started at the end of the 19th century, when all of the non-Europeans were already stirring with their own nationalism that they'd learned from the Europeans back to push back against the Europeans. And secondly, because Palestine was a densely inhabited, if very arid and poor country that had a unified population. It did not consist of competing tribes. It consisted of an entirely Arabic-speaking population. And yet the early Zionists just thought, oh, we'll just easily displace these people. So even Theodor Herzl wrote in his book that, well, the native inhabitants can be used to do things for us, like remove the poisonous snakes from the country before they are moved out or something,
wow.
as if getting rid of poisonous snakes was more important than moving these people out of their homes and taking over their area. And so it was a quixotic quest, and it barely gelled. It barely took place. And because it barely took place, it was quite a struggle. So they painted this for themselves in the nationalist terms as a great heroic struggle. It was such a wonderful miracle and all of these kind of things. And they were able to sell that to the Jews of the world, partly because of the Holocaust and partly because of the prevalence of anti-Semitism. Yet anti-Semitism itself was what the Zionist project had adopted, because it adopted the anti-Semitic idea that the Jews were a foreign body in the places where they lived, and they could not therefore abide there and had to all come and live in their own nation state and not live as a minority, not live as a minority in other places. And they also adopted the anti-Semitic tropes that diaspora Judaism was a bad thing, that the Jews, by being religious and relying on God throughout history, that was a mistake. They should rely on themselves instead. That the Jews, just as anti-Semitism tended to feminize them in the sense of making them, weak and the oppressed people, that they should adopt the opposite of that and should adopt a muscular masculinist nationalism, which is what it became. And so the problem with Zionism is not that it's Jewish, it's that it's not Jewish. It has no Jewish characteristics except for window dressing. And it is essentially like that. And then, of course, they adopted in adopting anti-Semitism, they allied with anti-Semites who were trying to get rid of the Jews from their own countries. So, for example, in Poland, interwar Poland, from 1918 to 1939, they Jews were 11% of the population, and most of them were exterminated in the Holocaust. And but during the interwar period, the Polish government was interested in Zionism because it was interested in, oh, well, this is the way to solve our Jewish problem. We'll just move all the Jews out of the country and they can go form another country, and that's fine with us. And so there was a kind of a overlap here between these two things. And so my objection to Zionism is that it's a nationalism, and I object to nationalism. So that's the crux of the matter, actually.
It's really interesting to see it in the context that you mentioned, especially in the context of the settler projects in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Uruguay, all of those places. I haven't thought about it that way before. And
those were
really
much older projects. They worked because there were Aboriginal populations. In the United States, for example, they set the tribes against each other because these tribes were mutually hostile originally. And so they were able to say, okay, you attack those, like the Pequot massacre in 1637. They brought a whole bunch of maybe Wampanoag Indians to attack the Pequots with them. I mean, they used the Native Americans against each other. And the population was also very thin, and it was decimated by plagues that the Europeans brought with them by accident, just because they had these new diseases that the natives had no immunity to, so they died. And all of that didn't apply, though, in Palestine.
Also, I think it is true that, so the Jews in Israel, at least historically and traditionally, are secular Jews. So they say that the God we don't believe in promised us this land. Whereas I think now there is a movement of ultra-religious Jewish kind of population in Israel. So there is that kind of, there was a danger of a civil war within Israel before all of this even started.
Well, they're trying to square the circle because in order to fit the square peg of Judaism into the round hole of Zionism, they want to then take up the religious aspect. And so just as religion has come back for many people in many places in the world in various ways, but it's also often wedded to a local nationalism. And the question is, which is paramount? And if the nationalism is paramount, which it must be, because the state eats the religion and the religion does not eat the state, then that is their religion. It's a religion of statism before it is a religion of religious practice and spirituality. Nonetheless, one cannot dismiss that there are people who are really also religious in a conventional way. So this union of religion and nationalism is a very difficult thing. For example, there was Rabbi Menachem Froman from the West Bank settlement of Tekoa, southeast of Jerusalem, whom I met when he came to Temple University. And he was an amazing person. And I would have to say that he was a actual religious person and more on the religious side, because of course he met not only with Yasser Arafat, but met with Ahmad Yassin, the spiritual leader of the Gazans, who later was assassinated by Israel. And he met also with Khalid Amaira of El Khalil or Hebron, where he signed the Froman-Amaira Accords, which they then presented to both the Israeli government and the Palestinian entity. And it was a peace plan. And Ahmad Yassin is said to have said, if all the Jews were like you, there'd be no problem. And the people said to Rabbi Froman, who was a West Bank settler and had been a member of the Gush Imunim, they said, well, if Israel withdraws from the West Bank, it would be a Palestinian state. What are you going to do about that? And he said, well, I think a lot of my cohorts would leave, but I would hope that I would be permitted to stay here because I love this land. And so, okay, he'd stay under a Palestinian state. I mean, I don't really see a problem with that. And so I was, deeply impressed by that. On the other hand, here you have, in this book here, The Empty Wagon, Zionism's Journey from Identity Crisis to Identity Theft by Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, whom I have corresponded with, who is apparently part of the Satmar community that are anti-Zionist in New York City. And he has a total denunciation of Zionism in that book. He said, and he's a religious Jew living in New York, and he says, Zionism is kissing the idol. So he has exactly that kind of perception that I conveyed. And I responded to him and I said that in terms of Islam, we have people who are like that too, and we want to, not enable them. And some of those statist movements, if they are going to substitute a state for Allah and set a state on the throne of Allah to be worshipped, then we do not want it. Just like the early Zionist, early Jewish settler in Palestine, Asher Ginsburg, who is known as Ahad Ha'am in Hebrew, one of the people. That was his nickname. He said in the 1890s about Zionism, and their statist desires, if this is the Messiah, I do not wish to see his coming.
I was going to ask you actually as well, because depending on who you talk to with the Palestinian-Israel conflict, to what degree do you think this is like a religious conflict, and what degree is it like a political conflict? But then even within politics, because politics can be religious politics or secular politics. So maybe to what degree is it like a secular conflict, and what degree is it maybe from even the Palestinian side?
Well, indeed. And if you think about it, it's very easy to answer that question. Because the question is, do you have people who are motivated by religion to go out and attack the other side? Or are they motivated by the fact that there is a dispute over land that is happening? So it's actually a materialist dispute over a material thing, the land. And it is not actually a spiritual religious dispute, because the previous Muslim Jewish relations were not characterized by that. They were not like that historically. And you could say that there was always an element of religious struggle that went on, and that should not be disdained. But the actual motivation for the political and military struggles all through history has been practical politics, where the religious motif is added by appropriation of the leaderships of the sides, using their own side and using the religion as a mobilizing device against the other. Were the wars for 700 years along the border between the Roman Empire and the various iterations of the Persian Empire on their eastern frontier along the Euphrates River area, were those wars motivated by religion, or were they motivated by politics? And this is in the pre-modern era where we aren't concerned with nationalism per se. And the answer is that these two great empires fought continuously, not because of religion, but the Sasanian Persian Empire adopted Zoroastrianism as a mobilizing religion to mobilize the people, and then they could say, oh, great Ahura Mazda is with our king and we're fighting the evil Romans. And then the Romans, in their turn, adopted Christianity in response to that. Constantine's adoption of Christianity had various motivations internally, but a major motivation was that the Sasanian Empire had this mobilizing ideology of Zoroastrianism, and the Romans wanted to respond with something that would have a mobilizing effect as well. So the religion was appropriated in both cases and eaten by the state. And that became a problem for Christians after that. And today you can find Christian scholars arguing about the heritage of Constantine, if it was a good thing for Constantine to adopt Christianity, which led to Christianity being the state religion in the Roman Empire. And some people will say, well, this was a disaster for Christianity because the state ate the religion, essentially. And that's exactly what Zionism does to Judaism.
Well, what do you think, Professor Khalid, about what's going on in Syria? Maybe post-Assad collapse. How do you see the kind of partnership between the HTS and USA and Israel and Turkey, and what are their aims, and how likely are they to be successful in using what they themselves, even in the United Nations, it was marked as like a terrorist organization, and now they're giving it kind of legitimacy. How likely is that to actually succeed?
I don't think they've actually removed the terrorist designation,
Not
have
yet,
they?
no.
Well, let's see. That's problematic too. And maybe
Because
they
I think it's not recognized as terrorist just by USA, which would have been easy to remove, but it's by the United Nations. So it's going to be a little bit more tricky for them to remove that label.
Yes. First of all, there are all kinds of different influences and forces here, and they are far from united. Even though they may have temporary alliances, and even though they may have the kindness of not denouncing each other publicly because they are hoping for some kind of cooperation or some kind of outcome favorable to their side. The collapse of the Assad regime was quite astonishing in its swiftness, that is true, although it's not unexampled. The collapse of South Vietnam in 1975 and of the American-sponsored Lon Nol regime in Cambodia in the same year, the collapse of the American-sponsored regime in Kabul in the wake of the Taliban, who actually had the impudence to take over the whole country before the Americans had even quite left it, because the American troops were still there, and the Taliban kindly, did not attack them and said, okay, you're going, so, bye-bye, we're peaceful with you, now the war is over, and so on. So a kind of another example, and the one that's most parallel, because those other examples, there was American intervention, military intervention, but an example that there was not, that's very parallel, is the collapse of Ethiopia, the Mengistu regime in 1991. If you think about the collapse of the Mengistu regime and the collapse of the Assad regime, these are very parallel. And the Mengistu regime was, fighting the Eritreans, and the Eritreans were like 5% of the population of the country, and the Ethiopians were 95% of the population of Ethiopia. And yet the Eritreans conquered Ethiopia. They actually conquered the capital city of Ethiopia. And this was, I have said, a cat eaten by a mouse.
Wow.
And it was a shocking downfall. And Mengistu fled and abandoned all of his government and so on to whatever would happen to it, very similar to how Assad fled. So there was a lot of similarity in those two collapses. Now, the interests of the states around them, although Israel and the United States were rejoicing over this and so on, it's still sort of like the Israeli settlers anticipating Trump will give them a blank check. It's kind of whistling in the dark because they don't know. And the basic fact of the matter is it's impossible for the regime of Julani, who is Ahmad Sharah, the new ruler of Syria, apparently, of the main part of Syria. it's completely impossible for him to reconcile with Israel. There are so many obstacles to that. Israel is not sponsoring him, did not sponsor him, and did not give him and his group any actual direct support. Israel is delighted, maliciously delighted, with the collapse of Assad regime, but it also has a reservation about it in that it wants the fighting among the Syrians to go on, and it does not want any regime to take over all of Syria. And Israel also has been always cultivating the sympathy of the Kurds. And of course, the likelihood of a clash between the new regime and the Kurds is considerable. And especially that the new regime is often seen as sponsored by Turkey in particular. And of course, the Turkish government, Erdogan, has a kind of so-called Islamic approach. And the Turkish Islam, however, interestingly, is more than any other country in the Muslim world extremely suffused with nationalism. So that Turkey doesn't really have any of the groups that are transnational that exist in other Muslim states, such as Salafiyya, such as Ikhwan, or something like that. It may have, the government there may have an alliance with Ikhwan, foreign Ikhwan, but it doesn't have any Turkish Ikhwan. And all the Turkish religious movements internally, such as the Fethullah Gülen movement, the Hizmet, and so on, are also suffused with Turkish nationalism. They only exist basically among Turks who are Turkish, and it's something that's very separatist off like that. So it's kind of an alliance of convenience then with these people in Syria, the HTS or Hizb Tahrir al-Sham. It's their alliance of convenience. And even before this, of course, there's a different alliance or a group of people sponsored by the Turks in the Turkish occupied zone, like around Manbij and that area. And then that's opposed to the HTS. But there was a sort of temporary alliance between them. The HTS was able to overrun the four big cities of Syria, Aleppo, Hama, Hems, and Damascus, the capital city. And then Israel even had the gall to take over the lower slopes of Mount Hermon, to occupy the demilitarized zone, and in other words, move into territory that had been Syrian in complete violation of the ceasefire agreement, which Syria had always upheld. And Israel explained that that was with the Ba'ath regime only, and now the Ba'ath regime was gone, so that didn't apply anymore, which is also false. And so the possibility of cooperation with Israel is nil. And that's because Israel simply won't cooperate with such a regime, not because the regime itself will not cooperate with Israel. Now, there are many reasons why Ahmad Sharah and the Salafiyya tending group that he belongs to could not also make peace with Israel. For one thing, he is maybe not born in, but from a family from one of the villages in the Golan Heights that was destroyed by Israel in 1967. And it's absolutely impossible that those interior Syrian refugees from the Golan Heights, who were in 1967 110,000 people, and by now have probably multiplied up to 500,000, it's completely impossible that they can say, oh yes, it was just and good that Israel occupied and annexed the Golan Heights. They can't say that. And so therefore there is no basis whatsoever for Syria joining a peace treaty with Israel unless Israel gives back the Golan Heights. And Israel is not in a mood to do so at the moment. In the long run, maybe something can be worked out, but that's not the tendency of the hour at all. Israel and the US are principally delighted because they feel that the Salafiyya, who have taken over the Syrian main cities and replaced the Ba'athist government, and thereby reunited Idlib and that enclave with the rest of the country, they feel that they being Salafiyya, are ideologically so hostile to Shia and Iran, and especially Hezbollah, who helped the Ba'ath regime considerably as their enemies, that they will cut off Hezbollah and make Hezbollah all the more isolated from supplies and be able to, excuse me, to really get Hezbollah now because of that. I would say about that, maybe, maybe not. We'll just have to see how things work out. First of all, the Houthis in Yemen are completely isolated geographically, surrounded by enemies on all sides, and they do not have any conduit of supplies because they cannot bring in supplies by sea either. And nevertheless, there they are, thumbing their noses at the world empire and fighting it, and shooting off missiles at international commerce in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Red Sea and so on, and shooting at the American Navy to boot, and also shooting at Israel from a long distance, and very intermittently, and not doing much damage, of course, but still, this is something very intolerable to Israel. And because they're so isolated, I would think Hezbollah being isolated, it doesn't matter. I would think that they would still be in the same position, and that the rejoicing of the Israelis over this is premature. I think that a struggle between the HTS and the Kurds is likely. And the HTS is not inclined to allow an autonomous Kurdistan inside of Syria. The Kurds, for their part, have not tried to declare an independent state because they know that that would make things worse for them. Similar to in Iraq, when the Iraqi Kurdistan regional government passed a resolution favoring independence or something, and then immediately the Shi'i-dominated government of Iraq attacked them and took Kirkuk away from them. And they lost a huge amount of territory as a result of that, foolish gesture to say, oh, well, we should be independent. Now, like other nationalisms, the ultimate goal of the Kurds would be to have a great, huge national Kurdish state in all the Kurdish majority areas, which are considerable territory, from Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. But at the present time, that's just not envisionable. And so the Kurds, in their part, are saying, well, we want to have an autonomous region. And the Ba'ath government left that open for negotiation. So the Ba'ath government had a peaceful arrangement with the Kurds where the capital cities of Hasaka and Qamishli, of two of the provinces in northeast Syria, remained under Ba'ath control, with the Syrian military there in those cities, surrounded by Kurdish-controlled territory, completely cut off. And that was just fine. Kurds and the Ba'ath got along, and they had a peaceful agreement over that because both of them had other enemies to contend with, the Kurds to contend with Turkey, and the Ba'ath to contend with other movements besides the Kurds. So the Kurds kind of got away with that. And the Kurds had greatly expanded their territory by driving out maybe at least 200,000 Sunni Arabic-speaking villagers from the Jazeera, from areas that they took over, and so forth. Even though they were at the same time trying to promote the idea, oh, we're not driving anybody out. Well, and Ahmad Sharah is saying the same thing. We're not persecuting any minorities. We're not driving anybody out. But in effect, that happened in that region. So some conflict, perhaps, between the new regime and the Kurds is likely to take place. The conflict that is happening right now is between the Turkish-sponsored group and the Turkish military against the Kurds along the Euphrates River. So that is a currently hot conflict that's going on right there. The other thing is that, is it possible for this small HTS group to take over the whole apparatus of the Syrian state and just have all of that work instantly? Not likely. It's more likely that this is a process that will take quite some time for them to get established. And that, of course, pleases the United States and Israel, because the Syrian state will be weak during this time. And the West will not remove sanctions. There's a tendency in the United States to not remove sanctions from any place that has sanctions on it.
Right.
They just won't remove sanctions against any place that has sanctions on it, because if they do that, they see that as a disadvantage to themselves. So they just want to continue the sanctions regime. I think that will be difficult to remove. I mean, maybe someday it could be removed, especially if um, wealthy oil state sponsors of the HTS, such as the Emirates and perhaps Saudi Arabia, were to intervene in their favor. That might have some effect, possibly, but I don't know. And then the HTS has to be weak itself in regard to the rest of the Syrian population, which probably, in general, do not really support them. That is, they might, let's imagine what percent of support they might have. They might have 25% support. If they have that much, that's normally what the support is for a government to, a country, is 25%. And usually that's enough to leverage power, because most of the rest of the people are indifferent rather than opposed. It would be like in Egypt when the Egyptian revolution happened and the Muslim Brotherhood regime, and then the military coup against Morsi and all of that. It was difficult to tell, but I would estimate that the Egyptian military regime has 25% support. And I estimate the Muslim Brotherhood had like 25% support. And I estimate 50% of the people were indifferent. And so 25% support in a situation like that is practically enough. It's enough to rule. But you might not get a lot of cooperation. There might be opposition. So what is the Alawite region going to do? There's this region of the Alawites along the coast and the mountains, the interior of the coast between Turkey and Lebanon. The Alawites constitute not less than 11% of the population of Syria. This is a major population then of several million people. And they can't just be massacred or driven out. That's not going to happen. So what exactly would happen there is very difficult to say. And of course, if you look in detail at the Alawite region, some of the least damaged cities in Syria were Laviqiyah or Latakia and Tartus, where the Russians had their naval base. These cities were not damaged in the war, and they are predominantly Sunni in population, but the hinterland is all Alawite. So how is that going to go down? And as usual, the big losers are likely to be the Christians, because the Christians don't have really any territory of their own. They're scattered in all of these towns, and just like in Iraq, the Iraqi Christians were just wiped out. It was a terrible disaster. The American invasion of Iraq led to the total wipeout of the Iraqi Christian community. I would estimate in Iraq that 80% of the Christians have left the country at least. And most of the rest, many of them are in Iraqi Kurdistan, where they found what I would call a reluctant welcome. And some of the towns that they've been able to repopulate in the area where Christian population was concentrated in the north, but they couldn't have any autonomous zone of themselves, so everybody attacked them, and they just lost and lost and lost and lost. It's very unfortunate.
Thank you. That's such an amazing kind of an overview. A number of things actually that I haven't thought about or heard of before. I didn't realize that Turkey doesn't have transnational organizations, religious organizations within Turkey.
Mind you, it's not because those are illegal per se.
Yeah.
It's because they just don't do that.
Yeah, and that makes sense actually, because it is surprising as well, and it makes sense at the same time, because as you say, they supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think they have their offices in Turkey. One would have thought that by now it would have gained sufficient kind of acceptance in the community, and it would have like local branches and stuff. That doesn't exist. Then I was thinking maybe like transnational Sufi organizations. But then even there, I don't think they have the strongest Sufi organizations are like the Malevis, which are the local Turkish, rather than
Well, they have
Naqshbandiya.
other than the Mevlevi Sufis. They have the Halveti, for example, is a big Sufi order in Turkey, but like the other things, it's a Turkified Turkish Sufi order. And Halveti, of course, in Arabic, Khalwati, the Khalwatiya, which is a very venerable Sufi order that goes back in Egypt to the Middle Ages, to the Mamluk Sultanate, and so on. In fact, my Shaykh Ismail Sadiq al-Adawi, I believe, was a follower of Khalwati, or at least that was what the Khalwati order was what he was in originally. Um, but there's no overlap. I mean, this is one thing, and this is the other. They're from the same source, but they're completely separate.
Well, yeah, I didn't think about that before, and it makes a lot of sense. And it kind of, when you think about that, then it makes more sense when you look at like Turkish politics and decision making.
Well, and then Erdogan is accused of neo-Ottomanism, trying to restore the Ottoman Empire, and so which is really kind of a overblown
Yeah.
way of putting it. He has, of course, reoriented Turkey from trying to get into Europe as a subordinate country to being its own master. And this is how Turkey has really been on a roll in the sense of having a big influence, especially over the Turkic former republics of the Soviet Union, which are 5 in number: Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Turkey had a huge influence there. First of all, they all adopted the Latin alphabet right away and got rid of Cyrillic. And so, and then because of all the refugees during the Russian conquests in the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, they came to Turkey. So a quarter of the population of Turkey are descended from people outside of the current region of Turkey, current area of Turkey. So there are people of Bosnian descent, people of Crimean Tatar descent, people from the Caucasus, Tatars, from Kazan and deep inside Russia. And then Turks who came from the Fertile Crescent, from the Arabic-speaking countries as well, who came back to Turkey or were driven into Turkey. And so they have all these other connections with all of these other places that still exist. And so the idea of Erdogan was, well, Turkey is also maybe not a first-ranked great power, but it's a second-ranked great power, and it has to show its influence in the region as well. And so that's kind of what he's been doing. Whether the Turkish population likes this inside of Turkey, I would be reserved about that. I think that the Erdogan's party suffered some diminution in its popularity because of the interventions in Syria and because of all the Syrian refugees in Turkey. But I think that on the other hand, campaigning against the Kurds, that probably has quite a bit of Turkish nationalist support.
I do think that Turkey is going to suffer some kind of a blowback for its policies in Syria. Personally, first of all, I don't think maybe even Erdogan thought that Assad's going to collapse that easily. And when it did, the government, I think at some stage, so first of all, as the Turkish thought that when Assad goes and our people will come in, then all the refugees can start going back, which hasn't happened. But secondly, because my family comes from Pakistan, so we're like neighbors of Afghanistan. And when you're a neighbor of a country with such a long kind of a drawn out civil war, tribalism, all sorts of factions fighting each other, it's impossible not to have that kind of blowback. We had weapons coming into Pakistan. We had like the politics was driven by what's going on in Afghanistan and how do we handle that. So these are troubles that Turkey is going to have to face. Whereas before they had at least like a stable government, whether they were like friendly with it or not, they had lots of political problems with them. But civil war next to your country, and Turkey is a peaceful kind of developed country, and to have like a huge, and I think also Syria by its nature, as you mentioned, there's so many different tribes, there's different religions in there, there's different people, languages. By its nature, I think um, you're going to end up, after a long drawn out battle, it has to be some kind of a government that is kind of less religious and more secular in nature, that can kind of accommodate all the different points of views and all the different people. But it's going to take a long time, and I think Turkey is going to suffer in the meantime. What do you think?
Well, I think that as far as the Syrian regime of Ahmad Sharah, assuming that this continues and is able to establish itself at all, so far it has been able to do that. First of all, it has to have a list of priorities of what it will undertake to pacify and reconcile in the country. And that means when he says, well, Israel is off the table, we're not going to fight Israel, and said that kind of as a reassurance to the US and Israel, first of all. But secondly, it's completely practical. Of course, he's not going to fight Israel. They're going to, first of all, have to establish control over the area that they have taken from the Ba'ath Party. And they probably lost Hasaka and Qamishli. Those areas, probably the Kurds took them over. And I think the Kurds did expand a little also when the Ba'ath regime was collapsing. So then he says, Ahmad Sharah, we're not going to permit independent militias. We have to have everything organized under a single armed forces. Okay, well, that's kind of obvious, an obvious statist move. I mean, any state to exist, of course, it has to do that. But how are they going to do that? So they have the Druze in the Druze mountain in the southeast of the country around Sueda, and the Druzes have their own militia forces. So are they going to go in and disarm the Druzes, who are even a more heretical sect than the Alawis? Like the Alawis are at least nominally Muslims.
Yeah.
The Druzes are Muslims when it's convenient for them to call themselves Muslims, and not Muslims when it's not. Technically, the Druzes claim they are the only Muslims, and all of the other non-Druzes who call themselves Muslims are not really Muslims.
Oh, wow.
And they that's kind of the official line. But in politics, like inside of Lebanon, Kamal Jumblat and Walid Jumblat, the Druzes are Muslims when it's convenient for them to be Muslims. They're part of the Muslim side, and when it's not, then they're Druzes. They're separate. And so the Druzes are one thing. And then there's Daraa, which is the town on the border of Jordan at the extreme south that played a very big role in the Syrian revolution in 2011 and on. And they have their own militia too. Are they just going to go in there and all those people are just going to surrender, or they're going to say, well, okay, we'll integrate with your forces? I mean, I don't know. That's going to take some negotiation, I think. And those people in the Daraa, they are Sunni Muslims with a Salafi orientation like Ahmad Sharah, so there ought to be some possibility of agreement, but nevertheless, that's going to have to be negotiated. And then there's the Alawi region. Have they just taken over all these Alawi towns and villages and so on, and then everyone just laid down and surrendered, and that's that, and then it's over, or not? I mean, I'm not sure what exactly is going on. And then they are accused of, murdering Alawi people in particular. And so there's that. That's another aspect going, well, this is disorder. So to have order, they're going to have to work on all of that. And probably in the way you said, they're going to have to be more practical about it. And this would be exactly like the difference between the first Taliban regime in Afghanistan and the present Taliban regime, which has turned out to be surprisingly liberal, shall I say. And of course, it's not completely liberal. I mean, it has its rules and standards, and you have to, men have to grow their beards, women have to cover up, and they have all of that. Particular rules that they've established. This, and this would be. But they negotiated a lot of things, and they even, like their former opponent and enemy, Hamid Karzai, the American-sponsored president, who insisted on staying in Kabul. And then he and others of his type wanted to be, partners in the Taliban government. And the Taliban said, no. You can't be partners. But they left them alone. And so they still are living there. They weren't arrested. They weren't punished. It was just like, let bygones be bygones, general amnesty. We won. Now the war is over. Everybody should celebrate. And for the Taliban to actually establish themselves in every place, though, that's another matter. And that's something that is an ongoing process. What are their relations with the Shia Hazaras, for example? I mean, originally, they're totally opposed, but now they have to live with each other somehow or other. And so what are the relations with the Uzbeks in the north? The Uzbeks, different group, they had their own leader who fled and so on. So I don't know. I think that there's a long path ahead of Ahmad Sharah to even form a Syrian state that's convincing in the area of the former Ba'ath state. And there are all kinds of dangers around that state. And I don't think that state itself can do anything to annoy Turkey. But Turkey, of course, in carrying on a campaign against the Kurds, that's a big deal too. So whether that's going to be a problem for Turkey in the long run remains to be seen. And then, of course, the origins of Turkish nationalism and its depth go back to the War of Turkish Independence, which really went on from 1911 to 1923. So while other countries fought World War I for 4 years, Turkey fought for 11 years, 12 years, but 3 times as long, 12-year war. Wow. From the beginning of the Italo-Turkish War in 1911 till the Peace Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. And because the Turks were bigger and the Allies could not defeat them, the World War I allies, the small allies of the allies that were fighting Turkey, the Armenians and the Greeks, really ended up with the short end of the stick. And so both of those countries are extremely inimical and hostile to Turkey. And Turkey has kind of returned the favor, being hostile to them as well. And their situation then, of those countries, was quite unfortunate. And but Greece, it's an opponent of Turkey, and they have to take that into consideration, even though they're much bigger than it is.
I would have thought, because USA played a big role and a prolonged role in the removal of Assad government, once that was achieved, I thought they might take this opportunity to just leave Syria because there's going to be a big mess and maybe they don't want to get sucked in. But I'm surprised that not only, I thought by now they would have thrown the Kurds under the bus and they would have just let Turkey handle the situation and packed up and left. But the fact that they're still there, they're actually at odds with Turkey in defense of the Kurds, was a bit surprising for me, but also maybe it makes sense because maybe they want to keep control of the areas where there's oil so that they can supply that to Israel, as is happening at the moment. But I think it'll also be interesting to see if and how that policy might change with Trump coming, because previously he did try to remove USA forces from Syria.
It's possible Trump might remove the forces, like the place where the American forces are in Syria, and the Al-Tanf base that's just north of the border of Jordan. They don't need that base. They have a base inside of Jordan a few miles away. That is completely superfluous that they have that base there. But it just kind of shows you that when the nation state gets its foot in the door in a place, they won't give up anything. And the nation states will just, tend to leave their stuff in place, and they will fight tooth and nail to keep every inch and so forth. A distant but best example of this to me is the refusal of Russia to give back to Japan 4 islands, or rather 3 islands and an island, a group of small islets, in the Kuril Islands, the refusal to give those back to Japan in exchange for a comprehensive peace treaty with Japan, because there's never been a treaty between the Soviet Union and Japan, and now between the successor state of Russia and Japan. And these islands, I mean, with Russia having all that territory, are just not a big deal. And yet, will they do that? Oh, no, they will not give up an inch. And they did say they would give up the smaller islands, but they wouldn't give up the two big ones. And so it's just like go figure. And probably the Russian establishment argues, well, if we make this concession, then China may start to demand back Vladivostok and the maritime province, which is a much bigger issue, or something like that. And then we'll just invite other groups, or Finland may demand back the territory it lost in World War II. And so the moving of anything politically, and especially the United States, where there's great paralysis because of the Congress and the way it is controlled by special interests and the way everybody rants about, oh, we can't give up any nationalist case. We have to remain strong. So we have to take as much as we can and never take any step backward. It makes it difficult for the U.S. to withdraw, quite apart from any concern for the oil of Syria, which is not really that much.
I think you're right in what you say about states never giving up anything. And it's maybe even more right in the case of Israel, who has always been reluctant to give an inch away that they take, which is why I think it's going to be difficult for them to even give up Golan Heights. But in addition, I think they want to take more of Syria as much as they can, which is surprising because they don't seem to have the resources to be able to maintain that while at the same time.
No, they don't want much more of Syria. They have a lot of expansionist statements and plans from the past, and you can see the map that the Zionists presented to the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, where each national group came to Versailles in 1919, and they were all presenting their plans for, expanding their nation states, and everyone was doing their negotiations that way, and Italy wanted this, and Yugoslavia wanted this, and so the Zionists were there too with their plans and their demands, and you can see their map, which includes a big chunk of Lebanon, Syria, and all of Jordan. Well, not all, but the useful part of Jordan, and in addition to part of Sinai and Egypt. And so they have all of these, greater Israel plans, so to speak. But just like Ahmad Sharah cannot take everything at once, but has to go step by step, starting with whatever is most crucial first. Likewise, the Israelis have to be concerned with what they are concerned with. And so they're concerned about the Gaza Strip. But the Gaza Strip, with an area of 141 square miles, is not really important land-wise. Some people have argued because of natural gas off the coast that this is a big deal, and so they want to get their hands on the natural gas. And what I think that is a specious argument. I think their argument is mainly entirely over security, and I don't think that the territory of the Gaza Strip matters to them much because it's too small to matter. And I think if they could cut the Gaza Strip out of Palestine and put it in the Pacific Ocean, they'd be perfectly happy to let it go and not take that as land because they don't need it. What they really want is the West Bank. And the West Bank, of course, has, maybe 2.5 million Palestinians in it, something on that order. And many, has over 300 villages and probably a dozen towns and so on. And so they want to oust the Arabs from the West Bank, but they have no means of doing that. So the whole issue is to control the West Bank, and minimalist Israelis would like to annex parts of it and leave the other parts with their Arabs and so on, and cut it up into little Arab reservations like American Indian reservations or like Aboriginal reservations in Australia. And so there are other people who would say both banks of the Jordan, and they make a big deal about, well, we should have Jordan. So, okay, if you want to go drive out 11 million people or 12 million people from Jordan as well, I mean, that's just biting off more than you can chew. And Israel created Amman, the greatest city in Syria. Now, it never happened in the entire history of geographical Syria, by which we mean Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, in other words, including Israel. So this area It's a historical cultural region that's, has a lot of diversity in it, but it's basically understood as a particular geographical region or zone. Um, that Anyway, they had normally Damascus, which is at the center of the region, that's been the largest city, and so now they want. They've pushed out the Palestinians. That made Amman the largest city. Amman, in a country that has no water, it's just basically a big desert. It has a very small, useful region in the extreme northwest where there are mountains and some rainfall and so on. And the whole of it is very arid. And possibly with global warming, we'll get more arid in the future. So you have this enormous desert area, a very small, useful area in Jordan, and it's extremely densely populated. Like Amman's urban sprawl is so huge, and Amman has half the population of Jordan in it. So it's a city that has, 6 million people, basically. If you count Amman and its suburbs, a contiguous area of built up area, 6 million people. I mean, that's almost as many as all the Israeli Jews. So they created this huge city next to them. And then they would say, oh, well, we'll just take over that too. Oh, no, you won't. And so their project is flagging. Like Israel, some of the Muslims think, oh, Israel is just delighted. It's won everything. It continues to win again. Our side is hopeless. We lost everything. It does nothing to stop Israel from massacring all the Palestinians and stealing all their property. And so, well, actually, no. Israel is not at all happy with the situation. The Israelis are not happy with it. They're all in a snit over it, in spite of their being in a snit before too, but they're now in a worse snit over everything that is going on. They're not pleased with it. And Israel itself is going to be doing some soul searching and thinking about things, because there are just certain sort of practical limits that they are going to get to.
I think you're right. Also, HTS, I think you're right. At the moment, they can't, even if they wanted, they can't do anything about Israel, because they're saying we're not going to fight Israel as Israel is bombing their lands. But that's something that they just have to
Well, they
put up
might
with.
shoot back when Israel is bombing them. They could do that.
Yeah.
And the
But
Israelis
also,
can't object to that.
I'm thinking, because obviously they've had bad relationships with Hezbollah, and I think in the past they've fought each other as well. But I wouldn't be surprised if things like this continue, that HTS and Hezbollah will cooperate with each other, and it might allow Iran to reestablish that corridor where it supplies weapons to Hezbollah through Syria. I've heard some of that's already started. And I've also heard how HTS is asking Russia, please don't leave Syria, because they know they might need other alternatives in that area to kind of support them.
That is all possible. I mean, it's up in the air. And frankly, the relations with Russia cannot be a number one priority. HTS has to be concerned with taking control of the country and controlling the Syrian citizens before it can think about, oh, well, we want to pursue revenge against Russia or something. And Hezbollah is a similar situation. That isn't their top priority. Hezbollah withdrew from the war against HTS, so okay, that's that.
Lastly, what's your thought on like Erdogan's kind of statements against Israel, even saying that his forces are going to march into Tel Aviv? To what degree is all of that just kind of empty slogans, and to what degree do you think at some stage, obviously now there seems to be like a ceasefire in the works, but if tensions continue, to at what stage do you think is it likely that Turkey will have to enter the conflict against Israel?
I think that's very remote.
Yeah.
I just think that's not likely to take place,
I agree,
because there's no contiguous border with Israel at all, and there's a considerable distance between them. The only way that could happen would be if the Ahmad Sharah regime of HTS forms such an alliance with Turkey that it allows Turkish military forces to be introduced into southern Syria to help protect the new
Yes.
regime. Given the character of the new regime, I think that is very, very unlikely to take place. I just think that's extremely improbable. And it isn't a great priority for Turkey politically either, because their priority is more their dealings with Kurdistan and the Kurds.
Yeah.
Their involvement in Syria is along the northern strip and in the area where there is a Kurdish population, which is in the north, and that does not touch Israel. I think Israel, despite its pugnaciousness, would be very reluctant to actually make war on Turkey or Turkish troops in Syria. I think it has so far left the Turks alone, and I think it will continue to do so because the Turks aren't doing anything against Israel. And I think that would be extremely unlikely. It is, however, I mean, it's an unlikely, very unlikely possibility that Turkey would ally itself with Syria in such a way that it would come to the defense of the new Syrian government. I think that's only a remote possibility. And I think also the Emirates, who are very powerful because of their sovereign wealth fund of several $trillions,
Mm-hmm.
And because of the Mohammed bin Zayed throwing his weight around in various places and trying to expand influence militarily in Yemen and Libya and so on, that because they the attitude anyway that they adopt regarding the new government will be quite important. And so if they adopt an attitude that's favorable to the government of Syria, that might be something that Syria would rather cultivate because that wouldn't put them under some kind of new military occupation.
Professor Khalid Blankinship, thank you so much for your time and also your insights and analysis. I personally learned a lot from this session today, and I hope it's the same for the viewers. Um, if you would be so kind, I would like to bring you on again because there's a lot of things that have been left off, but also a lot of other things that, as you were talking, I was thinking, oh my God, I could ask. Because we've got geopolitical analysis from a lot of people, but the wealth of like historic knowledge that you bring with you, it really helps to put things into context. And I'm thinking, obviously, I still want to discuss more with you about statehood, nationalism, um, how Islam is coping with nationalism, but also um, I I want to talk to you maybe more in future about like the Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, different countries trying to kind of position themselves for like leadership position within Muslim countries.
Sure, inshallah.
And also maybe if you're interested, I'd love to talk to you about Afghanistan as well, because there's a lot going on there at the moment, I think, between Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, India. I think that's really interesting right now.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Jazakallah. I really appreciate your time and thank you for coming.
Thank you.